Did you know that India has 28 states, each with its own way of doing politics? For example, Kerala focuses more on health and education, while Uttar Pradesh spends a lot on building roads and highways. So why do different governments make such different choices? That's where comparative politics comes in. It helps us understand why governments succeed, struggle, or change over time. We will discuss all these in today's session. So, let's start today's session on Unit 1 of MPS-004, Comparative Politics, Nature, Significance, and Evolution. Comparative politics is a subdiscipline within political science. But unlike other branches that are based on specific content, this one is defined more by its method. In simple terms, it means studying and comparing political systems across different countries. The aim is to identify patterns, differences, and similarities in how governments work, how power is distributed, and how political systems evolve. Comparative politics has ambiguous boundaries that are not sharply defined. It includes both method and subject matter. After the Second World War, this field became more prominent as scholars began exploring new political structures, especially in newly independent nations. Comparative politics is the ultimate tool to decode why governments succeed, fail, or evolve. Let's now look at what exactly comparative politics means and how it has evolved over time. Comparative politics tries to understand political systems by looking at how they function in different contexts and by exploring similarities and differences between countries. It asks important questions like, why do some countries have stable democracies while others struggle? Or why do some systems adopt federalism while others remain unitary? Earlier, this field was known as comparative government, which focused mainly on the structure of formal institutions like parliaments, constitution and courts. But over time, it evolved into comparative politics, which takes a much broader, modern approach. It's now empirical, multidisciplinary, and includes the study of informal institutions, political behavior, power struggles, ideologies, public policy, and in many more areas. This shift helped scholars understand politics not just as it is written in laws, but as it is lived in societies. Now let's look at how the study of politics has evolved over time, from traditional to modern approaches. So, what changed between the traditional and modern approaches to studying politics? The traditional approach was very descriptive. It focused on individual countries one by one, without much comparison. These studies were often Eurocentric, means they focused mainly on European countries and ignoring large part of the world. They examined formal institutions like constitutions, parliament and courts, but ignored the actual political processes and informal systems. The modern approach changed all of that. It became more comparative, looking across different political systems to find patterns and differences. It also became more analytical, focusing on explaining why certain political outcomes happen and how different systems operate. Unlike before, modern political studies include both formal and informal political processes, giving us a deeper understanding of how power really works. This approach also draws insights from sociology, economics, and history, making political analysis more complete, realistic, and multidisciplinary. Building on this shift to modern methods, let's now explore how scholars helped shape comparative politics into a more analytical and dynamic field. The modern field of comparative politics was developed by scholars like Harold Laswell and Gabriel Armand. They worked to clearly distinguish comparative politics from other fields like political theory, which is more philosophical, and international relations, which focuses on relationships between countries. They also helped separate it from area studies, which look at specific regions without building broader theories. These scholars believed that political research should be empirical, built on clear hypotheses, careful data collection, and real-world testing. This led to the use of classification systems, models, and theory refinement to explain and predict political behavior, making comparative politics not just theoretical, but also practical and analytical. And it wasn't just Western scholars who shaped the field. Indian scholar Rajni Kothari played a pivotal role in political analysis in India. In the 1960s, he introduced the idea of India's Congress system and demonstrated how caste, class, and coalitions influence Indian politics, a framework that still helps us understand political dynamics today. Now, let's move on to the next slide, where we explore how the behavioral revolution transformed the study of comparative politics. In the 1950s and 60s, the behavioral revolution transformed how social sciences were studied, including political science. It shifted the focus from abstract theory and formal rules to real human behavior, how people actually act in political life. Suddenly, it became important to collect real data, conduct surveys, and observe people's participation in politics. Behavioralism emphasized that science is not just about theory, it's about what people actually do. This shift encouraged comparative politics to adopt more rigorous methods and apply scientific principles. It also encouraged interdisciplinary research, drawing insights from psychology, sociology, and economics. And this revolution didn't stop at Western universities, it reached India as well. In 1957, when Kerala elected the world's first communist government through democratic means, scholars didn't just study constitution. They went to villages to observe real lives, real struggles. And they discovered that people weren't discussing Marx's Das Kapital. They were talking about rice prices. Because politics, at its core, is not just about theory, it's about roti, kapada or makan, that means food, clothing, and shelter. Now, let's move to the next slide to explore the new frameworks that emerged from this revolution, the systems approach and the structural functional approach. Two major frameworks emerged from the behavioral revolution, the systems approach and the structural functional approach. The systems approach sees society as a system with interrelated subsystems, like economic, political, and social systems. Each part has a function and contributes to the overall stability and progress of society. The political system, in this view, is like a machine. It takes in demands as inputs from society and delivers outputs in the form of policies. The structural functional approach borrowed from sociology. It argued that every political system has certain structures, like legislatures or courts, that perform essential functions. This approach aimed to be value-neutral analysis of all political systems. Which means it didn't judge whether a political system was democratic or authoritarian, but instead looked at how well its structures performed their functions. These models helped scholars analyze how different countries try to maintain stability, develop institutions, and manage change. But the behavioral revolution didn't answer everything. As scholars looked beyond the West, new challenges began to emerge. Let's switch to next slide to discuss them in detail. Most of these theories were based on Western democracies. And this raised an important question: can we use them to study newly independent or non-Western states? Some scholars said no. They argued that political systems in Asia, Africa, and Latin America have different historical, cultural, and social contexts, and Western models may not apply to newly decolonized states. Lu Xunpai, for example, spoke of non-Western country needed new theories. Others tried to adapt Western models like federalism or party systems to suit these new contexts. This debate led to the rise of large-scale theories like dependency theory and underdevelopment theory to explain the struggles of developing countries. But even the new theories had their limitations. As time went on, scholars began to question whether such broad models could really capture complex political realities. Let's switch to the next slide to see how these theories were challenged, and how comparative politics faced criticism and began to change its direction. Can a theory born in Oxford really explain Odisha's tribal politics? Political scientist Lu Xunpai said no. He argued that non-Western politics is a completely different story. Take federalism, for example. In India, it often means president's rule. In US, it's very rare and awkward. This mismatch sparked growing criticism of the so-called Grand Western theories. They were seen as too Eurocentric and abstract in their assumptions. Comparing countries with very different histories, cultures, and institutions turned out to be much harder than expected. Some scholars even questioned whether comparative politics was truly a distinct subdiscipline at all, or just a loose movement than a rigid subdiscipline within political science. As a result, researchers began shifting their focus. Instead of following universal theories, they turned to middle-range theories and started making more grounded, practical, context-specific comparisons. They began studying smaller regions, similar cultures, or specific variables rather than trying to compare the entire world at once. Let's switch to the next slide to understand what exactly is the comparative method and why is it so important in political science. So, what is the comparative method exactly? There's some debate. Some scholars call it a broad research strategy, while others see it as a proper scientific method. At its core, the comparative method is about identifying empirical relationships between variables across different political systems. It differs from other methods like experiments, statistics, or case study methods. It offers unique advantage because controlled experiments are not possible in political science, and these statistical tools require large data sets. So, the comparative method offers a middle path, helping us identify patterns across both similar and dissimilar cases, even when the number of cases is small. Let's switch to next slide to discuss strength and limitations of comparative method. The comparative method is very useful, but it's not perfect. One major challenge is controlling for all variables. Every country has its own unique context, history, culture, economy, and geography. Also, when the sample size is small, it becomes hard to generalize findings to a wider group. This method is effective in small samples, where statistical tools fall short, and useful for hypothesis building and theory development. It works best when comparing similar systems or using most similar and most different case strategies. It also helps political scientists study change over time within the same country or across regions. However, some challenges persist, such as controlling variables and generalizing across diverse systems. Let's switch to next slide to understand the development of comparative politics and its evolution. Over time, comparative politics evolved in three major phases. The first phase focused on inputs, how society influences politics. Scholars studied cleavages like class, ethnicity, and religion. The second phase turned to institutions, looking at regime types like democracy or authoritarianism. This was influenced by scholars like Samuel Huntington, who emphasized political order and stability. The third phase looked at outputs, what governments actually do. Together, these phases analyze regime types, policy impacts, and system effectiveness by combining political, economic, and sociological analysis. This led to the study of public policy and political economy, focusing on outcomes like development, welfare, and economic choices. Let's switch to the next slide and explore how comparative politics has become more practical and outcome-focused in recent decades. In recent decades, comparative politics has become more practical and outcome-focused. It now asks, what kinds of policies do different governments create? And how effective are they? This links politics to outcomes like governance and decision-making. This shift from abstract theory to real-world practice has led to a merger with public policy and political economy. Scholars study how policies are made, how problems are defined, and how decisions are implemented, and shifted the focus from abstract theory to practical policy studies. They also explore how political choices affect the economy, like how governments manage resources or plan development. This approach doesn't just analyze, it also encourages normative questions about what governments should do, making the field more useful for real-world policy making and public administration. Let's switch to the next slide, where we will summarize all the key points we covered in today's session on comparative politics. In this session, we explored how comparative politics has evolved from studying formal institutions to becoming a powerful tool for understanding political behavior, policy outcomes, and real-world governance across different societies. As we've seen throughout this session, comparative politics is a dynamic and evolving field. It began as a narrow, institution-focused study but gradually evolved into a multidisciplinary approach, incorporating behavior, culture, policy, and global comparisons. Today, it helps us analyze changing systems and public policies across the world. It offers tools to ask critical questions, identifying patterns, and understand political transformation. Despite its challenges and the fragmentation of the field, comparative politics remains a vital part of political science, especially for those who want to understand how the world is governed. Thank you for joining this session. In this session, we explored how comparative politics evolved into a dynamic, analytical field. In our next session, we'll study Unit 2, Comparative Approaches and Methods, where we'll explore how the system's approach, structural functionalism, and public policy perspectives help us understand political systems in a comparative framework.